Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Chigorin Defense with what I believe is the simplest way for white to play, which is why I'm going to cover this from white's perspective. It's going to be an exception in the series, and I'm also covering it from white's perspective because I believe that's the way for white to play. Nevertheless, I'm going to give you plans and ideas for both sides and also recommend what both sides should do. So let's get into the opening. d4, d5, c4 the queen's gambit, and knight to c6 the Chigorin. So far we looked at, well, different options, more aggressive than what we are looking at today. And today we are looking at this exchange, which does two things. If we look at the Chigorin, black has two ideas. The first one is sometimes take the pawn on c4, because you don't have an easy refutation to this. For example, if white does nothing, then takes. And the normal way for Queen's Gambit players to punish dc is to play e4. Unfortunately, in this position, the d4 pawn is attacked twice, so that wouldn't work. So one idea is, of course, to take the pawn. The other idea is to put pressure on d4, which is even more important. And the third idea is to simply be able to play e5, which is now supported by the c6 knight. So by breaking the classical principles and developing the knight blocking the c pawn, which in queen's pawn openings is usually incorrect and either played by very good or very bad players, black has three ideas: e5, dc, and pressure on d4. And by exchanging this pawn, we are getting rid of two of those ideas. Firstly, black can never take our pawn. Secondly, after queen takes d5 and e3, we know that there will never be enough pressure on e5, as we are going to see, because white has tactical motifs here. Okay, black only has one move here, and the next three moves are going to be forced. So e5, attacking the pawn, you have to defend, knight to c3. And of course, black does not want to move the queen. If black moves the queen, as we are going to see later on, then this pawn is going to be advancing to d5, which is precisely why this variation is very appealing for white. So black develops a piece and develops a piece with tempo, because now, of course, this pawn is attacked, because the queen is not attacked anymore. So white has to react. If you take here, that's simply no good. Queen takes queen. So you unpin, reinforcing this threat. Okay, so now again, black cannot take your pawn on d4 because you take the queen. And finally, after bishop takes c3, we reach the starting position of this opening. Here, white can choose either take with the pawn, take with the bishop. They're completely different. I'm going to explain both. But once again, once we take this pawn, queen takes, e3 defending, e5 attacking d4, knight c3 attacking the queen, bishop b4 pinning, bishop d2 unpinning, and now bishop takes c3. This is a forced line, which if you play cd5 on move 3, you're going to get, because all Chigorin players will know it up to this point. Now, I'm going to be recommending the move b takes in this video, and it is the slightly more popular move. Now, both moves have been played by many strong players like Kasparov and Topalov and very strong players. So both moves are interesting. There are very important upsides to taking with the b pawn, which I'm going to show you. Before we get into b takes, I want to show you why I think bishop takes is not the ideal option. Let's see what happens. Well, in this position, if black does nothing, for example knight f6, then you can simply take on e5 and you win a pawn. Because the queen is attacked, the queen cannot take on e5 because the bishop is defending. So black is basically forced to play queen takes queen, and after rook takes queen, you're a pawn up, and that's it. So after bishop takes, since this bishop attacks the pawn, black is forced to react. So bishop takes is more forcing than taking with the b pawn, but here are the downsides. So what black has to do is he has to take the pawn. So e takes d4. And in this position, since the pawn is still pinned, so this queen is attacked, black can never take the bishop or the pawn, white reinforces the pressure with knight e2. And this is the starting position. Of course, white is going to win his pawn back. That's not questionable. However, there are two variations which I just don't like for white. Here's the first one. Black can play three different moves. Black can play knight f6, which is the main move. Black can play bishop to g4, pinning the knight, or knight g to e7. Let's look at bishop to g4 first. This is the move I hate the most, and here is why. After bishop takes g4, of course, this is the knight is pinned, so this is not under as much pressure. And on the next turn, if you do nothing, black is just going to castle queenside. So, for example, a stupid move, and here, and now the queen is not attacked, and you just collapse. It's game over. So after bishop to g4, you have to play aggressively, so you play the move pawn to f3. And now, if black retreats the bishop, then white is much better, probably close to winning because of the huge space advantage. But here's the idea. Bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, and queen takes f3. And now, since you were already a pawn down, of course, the pawn on d4 is an extra pawn for black. For the moment, you have 4 pawns, and you're a piece ahead, but black has 7 pawns. And of course, your rook is attacked, and your bishop is attacked. So what you do is you play knight takes d4, tempo on the queen, and black takes your rook. And this is all a forced line. Knight takes c6, knight f6, you have to start developing. This is the main move, and now bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and knight to d4, and black castles. In this position, queen g4 check is a good move. The problem is if you castle queenside now, which would probably give you a better position, 2 pieces for a rook, black can take on h2, so you have to play something like knight f3, defending your pawn, and leave your king in the center. So after bishop g4, the whole line is forced. f3 takes, queen takes, knight d4, queen h1. This position you are going to get on the board. This has been played 18 times, white wins 61% of the time, but I don't like this variation because anything can happen. I believe that these pawns black has are very strong, and since the rooks have very natural open files, I think it's much easier for white to make a mistake than for black. Then again, black could get his queen trapped, black could, I don't know, blunder, but for the moment his king is safe. Of course, your king is never going to be safe, and he has 2 very good rooks. So that's bishop g4. A crazy line. The other line, knight g7, is quite boring, and here's what happens. You have to play knight takes d4, have to take your pawn back. And after knight takes d4, queen takes d4 is the best move. You can take with the bishop, but then simply castles. And after queen takes, bishop takes, and castles, this is very dry. You have the 2 bishops, but I don't think it should be enough to win because of black's queenside pawn majority, and he has very active plans. I mean, here you probably play bishop c4 simply to prevent bishop e6. But still, these pawns are going to get moving quite quickly. And I think black has enough. In short, white should not be winning this if 2 good players are playing, unless somebody makes a bad mistake. And what's considered to be the best move for black is neither bishop g4 nor knight e7, it's knight f6. And now again, you have to take your pawn. And again, here's what happens. Knight takes d4. In this position, black's main move is not to exchange, although he could exchange and get into the same position again, just with the knight on f6, but simply castles kingside. And here, since black queen is undefended, white has several options, but the best one is knight b5. Black should probably decline the queen trade and plays queen g5. So, and if you don't want to play knight b5, then you can take on c6, and after queen takes c6, you can play something like rook to c1. And again, your king is still in the center. You're 2 moves away from castling. You can play stuff like bishop d4, but queen d6, and I don't think it's such a big deal. I don't think your bishop pair is enough to win. Again, the queens are on the board, which sometimes mean this majority is more significant, sometimes it means it's less significant, but still, black shouldn't be worse here. Which, if you play against the Chigorin, that's not normal. Black has to be worse, because he played knight c6. At least in theory, he should be worse. Okay, but knight b5 is the way to try and punish that. However, after queen g5, black gets exactly what he wants. Now it's not easy to castle, and maybe rook d8 is coming. So white again has to justify his play and plays h4, queen h6, and now knight takes e7, you grab a pawn. But after bishop g4, this gets very tricky. Queen b3, rook a d8, queen takes pawn on b7, rook d6. I mean, again, your material up, and you have the bishop pair, and everything seems perfect, but your king is in the center. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces that could potentially attack your king in 1 or 2 moves, which means a high probability to blunder. This has been played 3 times, and the highest rated game is Luke Van Wiele versus Brynel Stellan. Of course, Luke Van Wiele is 200 points high rated, so he won that game. But it's possible to blunder here. So my point is, in this position, if you take with the bishop, black has 3 options, all of which either lead to very boring or 2 interesting positions. So if you feel like gambling, or if you feel like learning 20 moves of engine lines, after which you are simply better, then go ahead. There are lines you will be able to find. But here's the human move. After bishop takes c3, not bishop takes, but b takes. And this is a very human way to play, and there are human advantages after this move. And I find these positions much simpler to play. Now here's the point. Once you take with the b pawn, you get a new c pawn. Of course, you exchanged on d5. And the main idea is you want to go c4, d5. And with that space gain, you are going to have 2 problems in this position. And before I show you any theory here, I want to talk about 2 things. The first thing is what white should do. White should either try to play c4, d5 or f3, e4, d5. In either case, black has to break that center up. If there's a pawn on e4, f5 is your break. If there's a pawn on d5, c6 is your break. If there's a structure with c4, d5, e4, f3, f5 and c6 are your breaks. However, even if f5 happens, and this should be an improved f5 considering normal King's Indian positions because there's no bad g7 bishop, even if f5 does happen, white doesn't have to react. Because if there's a pawn on e4, there's a pawn on f3. After f5, if black takes, you simply reinforce your center. And if black plays f4, then you're perfectly fine. You've already established this great pawn chain, so there's no quick attack. So let's see what happens. Black has several options. Let's go through the rare bad moves first. Knight g7 simply runs into c4, and after queen d6 runs into d5. Usually this happening should not be bad, but this knight really wants to go to e7 in most variations. It's not that going to b8 is too bad, because you have knight b8, knight d7, knight c5, sort of Bogo Indian ideas. So that should be okay. However, knight e7 is better. So after knight b8, white should have a pleasant advantage. Okay, the second option I want to look at is, what if black simply exchanges? Well, after e takes d4 and c takes d4, you can immediately see white's advantage. White has 2 central pawns, black has 0. White is immediately better. However, this is a dynamic advantage in a sense that if central control is not important, if there are no pieces on the board, then this is just a weakness and black can create a passed pawn. So this is better for white for as long as there are minor pieces on the board and plenty of them, because black's pieces are going to be restricted. So for example, something like knight f6 and knight f3 and castles and bishop e2 and bishop f5. Again, black's pieces do not have as many squares as white's pieces, and this should be more pleasant. So this is considered to be bad for black, but it's not too clear, because if black manages to trade, then he is fine. Okay, and the 2 main moves are queen d6 and knight f6. Queen d6 simply preempts c4 and e4. So white doesn't play c4 because, of course, pawn takes d5. In the other lines, after, for example, knight f6, you can afford c4 because the queen is attacked, so you cannot take the pawn. So okay, queen d6, white cannot play c4, but he plays bishop to d3, a very normal developing move. And if these pawns are invited forward, which happens after knight f6, then it's easier to break them with c6 and f5. If they remain on their original squares, then it's very hard to break this up. Imagine this being a Grunfeld. You don't have a bishop on g7, you're never going to break this. So even if the pawns stay where they are, you still have the bishop pair, and you have a great central structure. Okay, knight g7, knight e2, black castles, white castles. And now I think b6 is the best way to play to prepare c5. So for example, f3, bishop e6, bishop e1 maybe, and playing for bishop f2, rook a to d8, queen to c2, you're going to play bishop f2. But once black gets in c5, he breaks up something. It's, again, you could play this if the knight moves away and gain some more space, but c6 is going to come and f5 is going to come. So don't be too tempted with these pawn pushes. You could end up blundering. But looking at a position like this, you have to love white. I mean, white has the bishop pair. Both bishops are very good. White has a great center. White has active plans, and black only has these two plans, c5 and breaking on d4. In the meantime, white can do a lot of things. Okay, and most people are going to play knight f6. So this is what we should be focusing on. This is the main move which you probably will get in most of your games. So after knight f6, you have two options. You can play c4, d5, but that's slightly risky. Here is why. After c4, queen d6, of course, and d5 and knight e7, as we said. What you want to do now is play e4. So most people play queen b1 in this position. But after castles and e4, it actually becomes much easier for black to break this and to occupy some very nice squares. So this is already slightly weird. f5, castles, f4, f3. This is what I was talking about after f5, f4. You're not getting mated. But still, this knight is a monster. Black can start g5, a normal pawn storm, and these bishops are just bad. There's almost no potential for these bishops to be good. In fact, the best thing you can do is to give up your good bishop for this knight on c5, and then you're left with this idiot here. So most people play queen b1. Queen a4 is interesting, and after bishop d7 you play queen c2 with the same idea of e4. However, black can now exchange cd, cd, and immediately play rook c8. Here you have a passed pawn on d5, which is great. But again, this is going to be undermined, and as soon as f5 happens, you probably lose d5, and your king is still in the center. So, not a big fan of that. The engine actually plays knight f3, which seems counterintuitive because it allows knight e4 and e4. But now queen c2 and bishop f5 and bishop to d3. This is an engine line. This has never been played. Knight takes and bishop takes and queen takes. And the engine seems to think white is slightly better. I can understand why this is better than the other lines. There are no bad bishops. But I don't think this is enough because, again, black can break the position open. So after knight f6, even though c4 seems extremely tempting, I think there's a much better way to play, and of course the main way to play according to theory is pawn to f3, where you simply don't overextend yet. And if black plays e4, which is not the best move, but let's just see what happens after e4, since there's no pressure on this pawn, you can now advance, and after queen d6 you can now play queen to b1. And if the pawn was here, you would have to advance to d5. Since the pawn is on e4, you don't have to advance. You would love black to take on f3 because then you develop your knight. Or if you're feeling, well, adventurous, you could take with the pawn. But bishop f5 is probably the sensible move, and now simply f4. And this has been played by Jan Gustafsson, I think. Yeah, he drew the game. I looked at that game. One of my favorite theoreticians, Boris Savruk, won a game from this position. So once this happens, now your center is kind of safe, because if ever c5, then d5, and it's a bit more solid. So against f3, e4 is really not something black should be considering. So black should just castle. And now the difference is, you play e4, the queen again goes to d6, you play d5, and the knight again goes to e7, and you play c4. The difference is you've already played both f3 and e4, meaning that f5 breaks are prevented, because takes, f takes, and f4 castles and the normal position. And your center is a bit more secure. Of course, on any c takes d5, you take with the c pawn, and you should be okay. Knight d7, again, looking at the c5 square is the best idea. Knight e2, knight c5, and now knight c3. And sometimes knight c3 is interesting for knight a4, which I believe is a very good idea. Sometimes this knight jumps into b5, and I've actually analyzed some positions with knight b5, which are very hard to play. So if black makes a mistake and doesn't play c6 straight away, then knight b5. So c6, you simply continue developing. There's too much defense on d5. So black has to break it with b5. And this is sort of the point at which you have to start studying yourself. I believe that this position is extremely good for white. I would enjoy playing it for white. If black doesn't play b6, then maybe knight g6 is playable for knight f4. Maybe simply bishop d7. Maybe b6 for either bishop a6 or simply defending the knight. Maybe f5 straight away, and after castles f4 and start an attack. So I like white here. I like white. And if you can get rid of this guy, which is going to be hard, but if black ever breaks on d5, then it's not going to be too hard, because you're going to be able to play bishop b5. So there are several ideas. After b5, for example, which I think is the best move, you simply take cd, and after cd, c takes d5. And after c takes d5, you play knight takes d5. And after bishop e6, it seems that you're collapsing, but you can play knight e7, and after queen e7, you can castle. Now this is a different story. Now you have the bishop pair in a very open position, and something like queen e1 and bishop e3, and this seems very scary for black. Especially because this bishop doesn't really have that much influence in the game. So once again, against the Chigorin, this exchange is extremely fun for white to play. You play e3, black attacks, you play knight c3, black pins, you unpin, black takes, and my suggestion is to take with the b pawn, because you have all of these ideas, extending your center, taking up a ton of space, and then once black attempts to break it, your bishop pair, which is your original advantage, becomes important. I hope you liked the video, hope you got something from this. This is what I play against the Chigorin when I played the Queen's Gambit, and it's a fun opening. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.